the Minora went down quickly, giving no time for the 7 men on her to prepare. 6 of them were strong swimmers, but the captain did not know how to swim at all. It was, therefore, a wonder when the schooner the Advance brought him into Newcastle, and he told the tale of having been in the water for almost 24 hours. He was weak, suffering from shock and exposure, but he was coherent and able to tell his story. He was also able to point the finger at another vessel, saying that they had been left to die.
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the lone survivor of the Minora?
Here we are. Enjoy!
Captain Gallant was brought to the sailor's home in Newcastle, placed in a bed, and given a sleeping draught in the hope that it would help him relax. He had suffered for such a long time in the sea that rest was surely the answer. The sleeping draught was not enough to overcome the psychological damage that Captain Gallant had suffered, however. Through the night, he would doze off only to jump up again, thinking that he was sinking below the water. Not that the morning looked any brighter, bringing the news that Captain Cook, a government steamer sent out in search of the survivors from his ship, the Minora, had not had any luck. Still, there was hope in the hearts of some. Captain Gallant had said that a steamer had lay to for the night near their wreck. Surely this had been them picking up survivors, and Captain Gallant had simply not seen their rescue efforts due to how hazy the day had been. This hazy condition also explained how they missed Captain Gallant. An unfortunate oversight, but one that could be excused. The Tangier was running behind schedule, but the public waited for her arrival eagerly, hoping to welcome more shipwreck survivors ashore. The only concern that was raised was that the Tangier did not call at Sydney to report the wreck. It was true that they were running behind schedule after stopping for a night near the wreck of the Minora, but a wreck was big news and would have justified their delay. Lacking any further news about those who had lived or died since the Tangier had still not come into port, the correspondent of the Sydney Morning Herald instead found his information speaking to insurance underwriters. With the news that the Minora had not been insured, people started to say that she had not been insurable. There was once again talks about how older ships needed regular inspections to ensure that they remained seaworthy. Asking around the shipping insurance underwriters in Sydney, it was generally agreed that had the owners of the Minora desired to insure her, they would have been more than willing to do so. She was still considered a strong and seaworthy ship. Captain Williams, partial owner of the Minora, gave a simple explanation. The Minora was 27 years old, having been built in 1867, had a tonnage of only 249, and in total with her cargo was only worth $1,300. It had simply not been worth it to insure the vessel, but that did not mean that they had not invested money into her. Only 5 months before, they had spent $1,000 in repairs on her. He supposed that the lashings of the bow ports had probably given way. That had happened before on her, and the ropes would become rotten and need replacing.
A note from the archivist. The other partial owner suggested a different theory as to why the Minora might have sank. He suggested that perhaps she had simply burst open, as another ship had in the recent past. The shipyard that had done her recent repairs, however, took offense at this suggestion, saying they definitely would have noted if she was in such poor condition and reported it. That seems to have been the end of such discussion.
It was not until Captain Gallant recovered enough to tell his story that the real tale of the sinking of the Minora came out. The Minora had left Newcastle with 455 tons of coal bound for Sydney, a regular voyage for the Brig, at 7 in the morning on Saturday, New Year's Day. As the day progressed, the weather became worse, and the winds were shifting, though the seas still seemed relatively calm. They hoped that they would be able to spot the Sydney lights. The lights had just come into view, and the voyage all seemed well around 9 o'clock that night. They were, therefore, shocked when their little ship suddenly shipped 2 big waves, one after another. Almost immediately after, the man who was on watch at the bow called out that she was going down. Captain Gallant could only say that this had happened sometime between 9 and 10 that night. As soon as the announcement was made, there was a rush for the ship's boats, but there was no time. Before they could even unhook the boats from their places on the ship, they were already submerged. The Minora made a sudden lurch forward and then sank bow first, disappearing completely under the water in the space of 5 minutes. Trying to get away from the sinking ship, the crew began to dive overboard and swim away, but Captain Gallant lingered for a short time. The men of his crew were strong swimmers, but he did not know how to swim at all, and jumping in the water seemed as frightening for him as remaining on the sinking ship. The ship's cook realized his hesitation and threw a life buoy around him. Having given the captain the means to float, the cook then dove into the sea, pulling Captain Gallant with him. By the time that the captain and cook surfaced, they were surrounded by pieces of wreckage from the ship. The cook managed to grab a beam, and both he and Captain Gallant clung to it. Around them, other members of the crew were also swimming to the surface and finding their own pieces of planking and wreckage to grab hold of. In total, there were now 7 men floating out in the middle of the ocean. They could not see one another, it was too dark. And they were slowly being scattered, but they still held on. The only means to tell time that Captain Gallant now had was the moon, and so all he could say was that before the moon went down, a steamer came towards them. When she was close enough for hailing distance, Captain Gallant and the cook began to call her, and he could hear the voices of the rest of the crew joining in the shouting, so he knew that they were all still alive. The steamer came even closer to them and slowed, giving Captain Gallant even more hope. On board the Tangier, Captain Neat could hear the voices of people in the water around 10:30 New Year's night. He could not tell exactly what direction they were coming from, since they seemed to be coming from all sides, and the pitch-black night meant that he could not see anything in the water. Since it was the night of a holiday, Captain Neat assumed that it was a holiday party in a boat that had gone too far from land, and now wanted help. The load on the Tangier was light, and the sea was rolling, causing the Tangier to drift, causing even more disorientation. Captain Neat shouted down towards the voices, "Have you a boat?" He would later say that he had heard no reply, but he kept his men waving lights around the side of the ship, and standing by with lines just in case. He did not dare lower one of his ship's boats, since he felt that he would have lost his crew on it if he did, due to the conditions of the night. At daybreak, they looked around for what the sources of the voices had been, but all they could see was a little wreckage. Having not found anything of significance, they carried on with their voyage. Captain Gallant had a different account. Seeing things somewhat differently while floating, clinging to a ship's beam, he heard the inquiry if they were in a boat, and shouted back, "No, send us your boat, we are on planking." No boat was forthcoming, and he and the other men in the water spent an agonizing night with the steamer near them, her stern lights visible, though he knew that a voice from the deck had called out to them, so they had been heard. At daybreak, He and the cook watched as the steamer departed, leaving them to die. It was acknowledged that the steamer had done a wide circle around where the ship had wrecked, but they were too far away to call to, and they never lowered a boat to take a closer look. Captain Gallant did not know what ship it had been, but he was able to describe her and her route. He was very interested to know what ship had abandoned himself and his crew to their fate. The men in the water knew that the seas were rough and the night was dark, so they had held on through the night, watching the ship's lights and the distant Sydney lights, thinking that the steamer would lower a boat in the morning to save them when it was safer. A couple of the men lost heart, and deciding that they were prolonging the inevitable, sank beneath the waves. With daylight came the realization that they now had drifted so far from the others that the captain and the cook could no longer see the rest of the crew. They were now alone. The Minora had sank in a major shipping channel, and more southbound steamers passed near them. The first was the Tagliaferro, which passed within half a mile, and seemed to see the wreckage because she slightly changed course before continuing on her way. Captain Gallant and the cook both shouted to her, but they were not heard. Next came the South Australia and one of the riverboats. These ships passed further away, and they could not be called, and did not seem to even see the wreckage. A few hours later, the city of Grafton passed within 50 yards of Captain Gallant and the cook, but though the two men did their best to gain her attention, they were not successful. Captain Gallant supposed that the sound of her paddle wheels had probably drowned out their voices. Captain Gallant was an experienced captain who had years of experience in the waters of Australia. He knew each and every one of these ships well enough to identify them even if they were not close enough to see their names. But as just a speck in the water, he was harder to make out on board the ships. Both the captain and the cook did their best to encourage one another through all of this, but after 16 hours, the plank they were using as a float capsized, and a piece of the plank broke off, making it less able to support both of their weights. This, on top of the exhaustion and exposure that both men had experienced, caused the cook to give up hope entirely. He fell unconscious and released his hold on the plank. Captain Gallant was not willing to let the cook go so easily, and he held the body above the water for an hour before realizing that the cook had died, and he was going to have to release him if he intended to stand a chance himself. His limbs were already suffering greatly from exposure and were becoming swollen and numb. Captain Gallant knew that soon he also would not be able to hold on to the plank, so using his life buoy, he lashed himself to some of the wreckage. He tore off strips of his clothing and stuffed them into his nose and ears to try to stop water from getting in where it would do more harm to him. Now, no longer needing to hold onto the plank in order to float, Captain Gallant resigned himself to simply floating. With this resignation came sleepiness, and he went to sleep in the life buoy, only to wake up every time a wave crashed over him. In this state, he did not notice the schooner until a red light appeared in his vision, and it was passing within a quarter-mile of him. In his own words, Captain Gallant began to shout and screech without stop, hoping that this time he might finally be seen. On board of the schooner, the Advance, Captain Kolberg had his attention turned to a voice in the water by one of his deckhands. At first, Captain Kolberg was certain that it was just a flock of birds, but the deckhand insisted it was a voice of a person. After a few more minutes, they were both convinced that there was someone floating in the ocean, and a boat was lowered. At 8:45 at night, almost a full 24 hours after the Minora had gone down, Captain Gallant was lifted into the Advance's boat, almost dead. He was in such rough condition that they were forced to haul the boat with him still in it on board. Captain Gallant had a close call. The flapping of the sails on the Advance had been so loud that they had not heard his shouts as they sailed through the wreck scene. The boat that was lowered to save him had to go back a fair distance before they reached him. On reaching Newcastle, Captain Gallant was taken immediately for medical examination and was found to be in better condition than the doctor would have thought for a man who had endured such a long time in the water and elements. He was weak and suffering from shock, but it seemed as though with care he would be able to recover completely. Having had a few hours of sleep on the Advance, as they cared for him on the voyage back to Newcastle, they massaged his limbs to restore the blood flow and slowly gave him water. After his rest, Captain Gallant was able to tell his story in a weak voice, his throat still suffering from damage. He stated firmly that he would like to know the name of the ship that had stood by all night, only to leave them the next morning. Captain Williams, the partial owner of the Minora, was the first to put forward that it was likely from the description that the ship that had stood by the wreck was the Tangiers, but he was not willing to think that they would have done nothing. Surely there were survivors on board the steamer, and they simply had not reached land yet. Others were less optimistic that the rest of the crew had survived, and some, including the secretary of the Shipwreck Relief Society, dismissed the account Captain Gallant gave of a steamer standing by at all. In his time of stress, surely he was mistaken, and no ship would have abandoned them in such a way. Nothing would be known for certain until the Tangiers arrived, so attention turned elsewhere. The reporters looked for the other ships that Captain Gallant had mentioned passing the wreck as well. The captain of the Tagliaferro did his duty and reported a large quantity of wreckage to the Marine Board, as well as a description of the wreckage. He stated, when questioned by the newspaper men, that he had not heard anyone in distress or heard any voices. The captain of the South Australian did not report any of the wreckage, since by the time that he had reached Sydney, the wreck was already well known. And the captain of the South Australian was shocked to learn of the news. The weather had been dirty, as he described it, but not by any means a stormy night. He had not imagined that it was weather that would have caused a wreck, and so he had assumed that the 5-mile debris field had come as a result of a collision. He knew Captain Gallant personally very well, and respected him as a captain. He was very relieved to hear that he was recovering, but he had never heard any voices in the water. He was asked what he thought the chances of any other survivors being found was, and he did not express high hopes. Though he acknowledged that the men were described as strong swimmers, he imagined the wreck itself would have taken a lot out of them, and land was far away. The arrival of the Tangier in Fremantle dashed everyone's final hope that more of the crew was alive. It also confirmed Captain Gallant's account of a ship standing by. Captain Neat told his story willingly to reporters, acknowledging having heard a voice, but standing by his choice to not lower a boat on such a dark night with rough weather. Some doubt was cast on his account that at dawn he had searched for hours, but there was nothing much that could be done about it. The Marine Board's investigation decided that the Minora had most likely foundered due to the heavy sea bursting the hatches, since she had oversized front hatches to help her load and unload lumber cargoes. Captain Gallant was exonerated from all blame. The same could not be said of Captain Neat, who received a letter asking him to explain his refusal to lower a boat and his action of leaving the castaways. If he ever responded, it was not recorded. Captain Gallant did not even know the real name of the cook who had most likely saved his life, or any of the rest of his crew for that matter. They were a new crew. All of them had just been signed on during the holidays. For at least one of them, it was his first ever voyage as a sailor. From the mate down, Captain Gallant knew the first names or nicknames only of his entire crew. The mate had been hired last minute to replace the usual mate who was injured. He knew that some of the men were single, and some of them were married, but he knew very little about them. Even when the newspaper got the actual list of crew from the owners, there were doubts. It was thought that it was possible that 2 of the men had not shown up and had been hastily replaced. All that the papers could say with some finality was that 6 men had drowned when it would have been possible to save them. Captain Gallant did eventually recover, and received a subscription fund from his friends for the hardships that he had undergone. The last that was noted of the wreckage of the Minora was in the diary of the famous diarist Edgar White, who on the 16th of February was on a fishing trip in Broken Bay when their net snagged. They were told that the obstacle was most likely the wreck of the Minora, which had sank a few weeks before. So the Minora dropped from the public mind. She was a small ship with a small crew, so she did not hold attention like some of the larger wrecks. She had never been front-page news. The public imagination had been stirred by the story of Captain Gallant and the questions about the Tangiers, but once the mystery was gone, the coverage also disappeared. All she left behind was Captain Gallant, to continue with life the best he could, acknowledging the miracle that the only person on the ship who had not known how to swim had been the only man to survive.
If you would like to learn more, please see the Brig Minora foundered at sea from the Sydney Morning Herald, January 4th, 1898, or see our other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.